the technicalities here. Tim Wright is currently Asia Pacific Director of ICAN. He has worked in ICAN since its inception in 2006, following up all processes that eventually led to the nuclear ban as a campaigner with a law degree from the University of Melbourne, Australia, orchestrating the coordination of the ICAN campaign from Oslo through Vienna, Mexico, and New York. He was instrumental in ensuring the focus on legal base for the efforts to reach a nuclear ban and a nuclear-free world. In today's lecture, Tim will provide his thoughts on the topic, the role of civil societies in reaching the goal of banning nuclear weapons. A heartily welcome to the final speaker of today's event, Tim Wright.
Thank you very much. It's wonderful to be with you here in Oslo to celebrate the Nobel Peace Prize. Thank you, yes. But also to discuss how we can make sure that this incredible new international agreement, the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, achieves its objectives. Of course, the adoption of the treaty earlier this year was an incredible milestone, but unless we work effectively in coming years, this treaty won't achieve its objectives. So we need to really galvanise global support for it and ensure that we get countries like Norway and like my own country to change their position on this treaty. I'm from Australia, and we too claim that nuclear weapons are essential for our security, and that runs against the new international norm. The international community has clearly stated now that these are unacceptable, illegal weapons. And I think it will be very hard for our countries that claim to be responsible international players to maintain their current position on this issue. I wanted to begin by reflecting on a comment that Setsuko Thurlow made yesterday in ICAN's Nobel lecture. She said that many people have failed to recognise the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki as atrocities, as war crimes, and that it's this failure that allowed the nuclear arms race to take place, an arms race that's continuing to this day. And I think, in a sense, she was contrasting our reaction, or the international community's response to the Holocaust, with our response to the atomic bombings of Japan, when she said that we all need to be alert to the banality of evil. And that was a reference to the Hannah Arendt's essay on Eichmann, when she was referring to just how kind of ordinary he was in saying that, you know, I was just following orders. I was just taking directions from above. What I was doing was perfectly lawful. And, you know, the way that we've responded to the Holocaust is very different from the way that we've responded as an international community to the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. I think that was a really important point that she made. I want to talk about how we've worked over the past decade to promote the idea of a global ban on nuclear weapons. Of course, ICAN's work builds on 6 decades of work before the founding of our campaign in 2007. We decided to set up this campaign because we felt that the global anti-nuclear movement had been languishing and that we needed to get better organised and we needed to get a treaty. So the idea of a treaty banning nuclear weapons was central to our campaign from the very beginning. We believe in the power of international law to bring about change, and we believe in the power of the people to influence international law, to create new international law. And we were greatly inspired by the success of the ICBL, the International Campaign to Ban Landmines, which a decade earlier had, within a fairly short time frame, managed to galvanise global support for the Mine Ban Treaty. And we wanted to emulate that success. And around the same time that our campaign was founded, the process for the cluster munition ban was getting underway, and was using the same kind of humanitarian framing that we also wanted to use as a campaign, and a similar campaign structure of bringing together a coalition of organisations rather than creating a huge kind of bureaucracy of our own. Instead, drawing on the resources that already existed and ensuring that we were working effectively together as a coalition. I was a law student at the time that we set up the campaign, and there were many doctors involved from international physicians for the prevention of nuclear war. And it was so exciting for me personally to kind of be part of this group of amazing individuals with a very clear vision. And I mean, I was just kind of helping with the website and putting together a few printed materials and making sure that the events all kind of went to plan, keeping time and all of those kinds of things. But it was, the idea that we could, as a civil society coalition, change international law to address perhaps the greatest threat facing humanity was really special, and to kind of reflect on that now that we've achieved the treaty and now won the Nobel Peace Prize. It's been a really remarkable journey, and so many thousands of people have been part of it. A few hundred of us are here in Oslo to kind of celebrate it, but it has been a much bigger effort with many more people involved. When we launched the campaign, we coordinated the updating of a model nuclear weapons convention, which had been drafted a decade earlier. This was a very detailed treaty, more detailed than the treaty that was actually adopted earlier this year. And it set out a kind of a phased program for the elimination of nuclear weapons. We were talking about kind of detailed verification mechanisms and kind of including all of that in the one instrument. That was the initial idea that we presented to governments. And we didn't present the model convention as something that they should adopt in its entirety, but rather something that could stimulate discussion and that governments could take ideas from in drafting a treaty, and really kind of to show that this could be done and it had been done for other weapons. I don't know what, I guess I just... So one of the key messages that we have presented as a campaign is the inconsistency with approaches to other weapons. So clearly there are comprehensive prohibitions on other indiscriminate weapons, but until now there hadn't been a comprehensive prohibition on nuclear weapons. And I think that's a message that really resonated with the public. It was easy to, people felt, that's an absurd situation, that the very worst weapons of all had not been comprehensively prohibited. And really kind of showing that these are not political weapons. These are not this isn't just about theories, abstract theories, but these are real weapons that create devastating harm, as evidenced in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. But also through the testing of these weapons, we've come to understand better the full extent of the consequences that they have, particularly in terms of the radiological effects. So we took this idea of a nuclear weapons convention to the NPT meeting in 2007 and kept promoting it at the NPT prep comms leading up to the review conference in 2010. Oops. So we had Jodie Williams from the Landmine Campaign speak at that conference, again trying to reinforce the connection between that process and the process that we were trying to start with nuclear weapons, and we were pushing then for a commitment at the review conference to start negotiations on a nuclear weapons convention. And many governments supported that call. But of course, as Gru and others have commented, the NPT review meetings, the practice is that decisions are made by consensus, unanimity. And it was not possible to get that clear commitment. There were a couple of references, factual references, to the fact that the Secretary General of the UN had described the treaty as the model treaty as a good point of departure for negotiations on a nuclear weapons convention. And there was also a very important reference in the outcome document of the review conference to the catastrophic humanitarian consequences that would result from any use of nuclear weapons. So that's something that we had pushed for, and really kind of allowed for the creation of what became known as the Humanitarian Initiative that ultimately led to the adoption of the treaty. The Obama presidency had created a lot of hope, and we were operating in a different environment then than we were basically in the lead up to the review conference, people had very high expectations that a breakthrough could be made, and people were generally happy with the fact that an action plan had been adopted, but we were always kind of doubtful about the importance and significance of that action plan, and were questioning whether countries, particularly the P5, the nuclear weapon states, would fulfill those objectives. And we didn't want to get kind of trapped into just focusing on that. And it was very important that this treaty process that we were trying to get underway would go ahead regardless of what was decided at the review conference. So the language in the review conference outcome document gave the Norwegian government a hook to hold the first ever conference on the humanitarian impact of nuclear weapons. We had a great team of campaigners here in Norway, some of whom are in the room, who helped to organise the civil society forum ahead of the official conference, and really helped to get the government to make that commitment to host the conference. So this was a remarkable initiative of the Labour government of Norway at the time, and to think that this is the first time that the international community had gathered to discuss what nuclear weapons do. It's extraordinary. It took more than 6 decades for that to happen. And the government was very adamant that we should remain focused on simply a fact-based discussion about the consequences and not veer into discussions about what kinds of legal mechanisms should be developed to address the nuclear threat. But we as a campaign felt that our role was different from that of the governments that were pushing this process forward. And we were very clear at that stage that we expected this process that Norway had initiated would result in a nuclear ban being adopted. So the outcome, the factual summary of that conference was kind of limited to some of the general conclusions about what nuclear weapons do, the fact that there would be no meaningful response capacity, the fact that the radiological effects of nuclear weapons transcend national boundaries, that this is a global threat and every country in the world has a stake, and every country has a responsibility to work to address this issue. I think that was the general message that came out of the Humanitarian Conference in Oslo. We then went to Mexico, Nayarit in Mexico, for the second conference on the humanitarian impact of nuclear weapons. This was early in 2014. And the discussion there really shifted towards the idea of a ban. And in a sense, we were helped in that respect by some of our opponents, because they said at the very beginning, we do not want a ban treaty. And so that really focused attention on the idea of the ban treaty. I remember being quite embarrassed by my own government. Our foreign minister on the first day of the Nayarit conference published an opinion article in our newspapers just saying why she opposes the ban, and she said the catastrophic humanitarian consequences of nuclear weapons are precisely why they're so effective. And remarkably, she repeated that line when she visited Hiroshima later that year. This is she's still our foreign minister, and this kind of explains why, she's why Australia has adopted such a terrible position on this throughout this process. And I remember kind of feeling that we as Australian campaigners had almost kind of let the team down. People were looking at me and saying, what's going on, Tim? This is terrible. But as I said, it did really put the debate. It helped to put the debate where it needed to be. And the Mexican government, in the factual summary, referred to the fact that prohibition typically precedes the elimination of nuclear weapons, that prohibition is a stimulus for it. And that was a really important point for us to make as a campaign, that this is a step towards elimination. And some governments said, no, you have to eliminate nuclear weapons before you make them illegal, which is such a preposterous argument, and it's not how it's been done with other weapons, and certainly shouldn't be that way with nuclear weapons either. So that was referred to as the Nayarit was the point of no return. That was the famous line in the chair's summary. Alice Slater was. I remember being there with Alice saying, and she said, we need to put music behind this. And, this was such a kind of a rock star moment when the chair of that conference got up and made that speech. And it was much stronger than we had expected, actually, which created huge expectations for the following conference, the third Humanitarian Conference in Vienna. And I think that the Austrian ambassador, who was kind of responsible for the convening of that conference, was quite taken aback, and he felt the burden on his shoulders that created. So this is Vienna. At every one of the humanitarian conferences, we got together as a campaign. We were the official kind of civil society partner, and we really wanted to use this as an opportunity to mobilise, to build our network, and to make sure that the governments heard our voice. So the Vienna Conference concluded with the Austrian Pledge, and the key kind of message from this pledge is that there is a gap in the international legal regime relating to nuclear weapons, and that gap needs to be filled. And it was a pledge to stigmatise, prohibit and eliminate nuclear weapons. We as a campaign worked very hard for almost a year to get countries to sign that pledge. And it provided a very important narrative for us the following year when governments met for the NPT Review Conference, the 2015 Review Conference. And there was a lot of disappointment, I guess, that the Review Conference failed to achieve an outcome document. But we were able to say that despite that failure, we have the success of 100-something countries rising up and saying, we are committed to prohibiting and eliminating these weapons. And so that was done through the Humanitarian Pledge as it became known. The next step in our campaign was to, we wanted at that stage to go straight into negotiations. In fact, we would have liked to go into negotiations even earlier. But the next step for us was the open-ended working group in Geneva. We were initially a little bit cautious about this. We weren't sure how effective it would be, but we felt that it could be used as a forum for exploring the different options available to us in terms of what instrument is needed to fill the legal gap, to fulfil the pledge that the governments had taken. And this was the first time really that governments discussed in detail the idea of a nuclear weapon ban treaty. So actually going ahead and prohibiting nuclear weapons, even if nuclear-armed nations weren't part of the process. And this was when we first started talking about going ahead even without the nuclear-armed nations, this was such a kind of radical idea. And it took people, it took a lot of work to convince people that this was the right approach. We never said that nuclear-armed nations shouldn't be part of the process. Our message was always that every country should be involved, but if they choose not to be involved, then that should not prevent the process from moving forward. So they can't continue to kind of hold the world hostage. That's what they had gotten away with for years. Particularly in the NPT context, but also in the context of the Conference on Disarmament. Always the nuclear-armed nations would insist on this right to veto any decision. So this is Tani Tongpakti, the chair of the Open-Ended Working Group. And it was a surprisingly dramatic working group because my government called a vote. And this is quite unusual at a kind of meeting like this. There had been many efforts to achieve agreement on the report. But Australia, on behalf of the group of so-called weasel states, those under the umbrella of nuclear weapons, said, we cannot accept this. And actually, even though I said, I'll take back what I just said, because Australia wasn't acting on behalf of all of the umbrella states. Some of them really didn't like the fact that Australia had called this vote, which was very divisive and went against, I think, those who, the interests of those who were trying to stop this process, because it made the working group report much more, elevated the importance of it. Australia made many strategic errors at that conference. At one point, the ambassador said, we do not accept that a majority of states present at this working group believe that a conference should be negotiated next year, convened next year to negotiate a treaty. And that was an invitation to governments to declare their support. We first statement, the African group, 54 countries. Then the Latin American and Caribbean group got up. We support the idea of a conference next year, another 33 countries. Then the Southeast Asian countries got up. Yep, that's a good idea. 10 countries. And I think we had half a dozen Pacific Island countries. In total, it was well over 100 countries declaring their support. So not only a majority of those involved in the working group, but a clear majority of UN member states overall. So thanks, Australia, for that. I think some of the diplomats are secretly on our side. And it was this working group that gave Mexico and others the opportunity to present a resolution to the General Assembly in 2016 to establish the mandate for negotiations. One of the things that we did at the working group was present an appeal to the chair signed by over 800 parliamentarians around the world. And the main reason that we did this was to demonstrate that even though some countries, those under the umbrella, are officially opposed to the treaty, there is very significant support among, from some politicians in those countries. And we now have a parliamentary pledge, a similar pledge, to gain support for signature and ratification of the treaty. This was the first committee session in 2016 to get the resolution adopted. We did a lot of work in the first committee. And the reason that we chose the first committee as a forum is that it's representative. All UN member states are part of it, and it meant that we were able to kind of, decisions are made by majority, and this was a much more effective forum for us than the NPT meetings in bringing about change. We initially were not sure whether a UN process would be the most suitable process, or whether we should be pushing for an Oslo, Ottawa-style process that was kind of where the treaty was negotiated outside the UN. My own opinion is that it worked very well at the UN, and it was easier, I think, for us to argue that governments that were boycotting the negotiations were doing the wrong thing, because this was a UN process, and to not be part of it was like kind of rejecting the international community. So I think that argument would have been harder to make if this had been a negotiating process of the kind used for landmines and cluster munitions. This was the incredible moment, 7th of July 2017, when the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons was adopted. And Setsuko Thurlow gave an incredible speech, which has now been animated. I encourage you all to look at it. And she said, this moment marks the beginning of the end of nuclear weapons. And you recall too from her speech yesterday, she said, having witnessed humanity at its worst, I witnessed that day humanity at its best. And I think it was. I mean, this is incredible. 122 countries getting together, working cooperatively to try to create movement on an issue that has been stalled for decades. And this is the best hope that we have of moving forward at a moment of a great global crisis. And when we look at what's happening between the United States and North Korea and in other parts of the world, we can't just throw our hands up in despair. We need to tell people that this treaty exists, that there is an alternative, and we need to be very confident that our countries, even if they were not part of the negotiations, will join the treaty. And they'll join it because the public will demand it. And countries like the US and UK and France have already said that they'll never join the treaty. But how can they say that? How can the leaders of today say that the leaders of tomorrow will never sign it? They can't predict the future. They don't have control over the future. They can stand on the wrong side of history, but ultimately the people will decide whether their countries join. And it's been amazing to see already the way that campaigners around the world are using this treaty. There are nuns in the United States who are visiting nuclear weapon facilities and holding up copies of the treaty and saying, you are in breach of the norms that this treaty enshrines. We now have a clear majority of Labor parliamentarians in Australia who have signed the Parliamentary Pledge, saying that they will work to get Australia to sign and ratify this new treaty. We have an inquiry that's now going to take place here in Norway about whether to sign. We have a radical left Prime Minister now in Iceland who has signed our pledge and says she wants to get on board the treaty. We have an opposition leader in the United Kingdom, a nuclear-armed state, who has been involved in our campaign over the past decade. He was at a number of the humanitarian conferences. Things can change. The world doesn't have to be like this. We can't accept these as a fixture in our world, and that's the mistake that so many people have made, just believing that these are the kind of great powers who can forever dictate how we live our lives, and that we must live our lives under the mushroom cloud of fear. I'm confident that we can get this treaty entered into force quickly. It has a threshold of 50 ratifications for entry into force. And we just need to start flipping countries, moving them from being against us to being on our side. And just continuously, we need to keep saying that it is inevitable that these countries will sign the treaty. It might happen sooner or later, but it is inevitable. That's the message as a campaign that we need to put forward. This is one of my last slides. It's one of my favourite photos. My colleagues on the roof of the Foreign Ministry in Australia just a week before we won the Nobel Peace Prize. And one of the reactions to the Nobel Peace Prize was there was a tweet by the journalist or the photographer from the Associated Press. He said, "See these people on the roof? They just won the Nobel Peace Prize." We can't shy away from, sure, we need to keep advocating at the UN. We need to keep engaging in national parliaments, but we also need activism. We've got a treaty now. We've got a treaty and a Nobel Prize. That's stiff competition. So thank you, and good luck. Let's make this treaty work.
Thank you very much. Thanks for that liberation law lecture. That's what we should call it, right? Questions? Okay, do we have time for one short question, maybe? What's the question?
Thank you so much. It's been really inspiring to be part of the ICAN campaign. And I just want to pick up on the role the public can play in reinforcing the treaty legally, given the mention of the dictates of public conscience in the preamble. Because we had a very inspiring campaign in the 90s that helped people understand a little bit the Martens clause, that it's actually us that decide what's acceptable and what isn't. And how could that possibly help with the ICAN campaign now?
Sorry.
You're missing the mayor now.
No, sorry. I didn't realise there were questions. I missed part of that, but it was about the dictates of public conscience. I think there are many parts of the preamble that we can use in our campaigning. One that I really like is the reference to the disproportionate harm that nuclear weapons have had on Indigenous communities. We're using that in our campaigning in Australia because obviously the nuclear testing in Australia has primarily affected Aboriginal groups. And just generally the humanitarian framing, I think, is something which really resonates with the public. I think we need to do, in addition to a kind of a campaign to get countries to sign and ratify the treaty, we just need to educate people about the fact that this treaty exists. And that's something that all kind of institutions can be engaged in. It's not taking a position. You don't have to be for or against the treaty. Just teach people what is in it. Every UN information centre around the world should be providing that information. All UN associations should also be involved in this kind of work. And we need to get it into the national curriculum of every country. We teach the basics of international law to students everywhere, and this needs to be part of the story of international law, and it needs to be part of the story of the United Nations. We have a huge amount of work to do just in that respect. And we can't mobilise the public without educating and sharing the information.
Thanks, Tim. I just, for